This event is the fourth in a series of panels focused on the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy's open access volume, democratizing risk governance, bridging science, expertise, deliberation, and public values. The book is the fruit of a multi-year research project spearheaded by the ISSP. L'événement aujourd'hui va avoir lieu en anglais, mais si jamais il y a des questions en français, soyez-vous bien à l'aise de les poser dans la langue de votre choix. On a un animateur qui est bilingue. We'll begin today with the Indigenous affirmation from the University of Ottawa. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada, who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So before getting into the event for today, I'd like to introduce you to the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. My name is Monica Gattinger. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa at the School of Political Studies, and I am also director of the ISSP. We are a cross-faculty institute at the university, exploring the links among science, society, and policy. Our 5-year strategic vision is to help Canada transform decision-making to meet the grand challenges of our time. At the Institute, we pursue this vision by strengthening relationships among academia, business, government, Indigenous organizations, and civil society. The book we'll be discussing today is a nice illustration of that in action. We've got 3 key focus areas in our strategic plan: fostering public trust in expertise and expert-based decision-making, supporting co-production of government policies by government, business, Indigenous, academic, and civil society leaders working together, and weaving together technological and social innovation. Again, you're going to see those areas shine through in the session today. So our event today is the 4th and final event in a series of book promotion panels for our open access book. I'll show you here. Democratizing Risk Governance. See if I can get this to, it doesn't want to, there we go. Democratizing Risk Governance, Bridging Science, Expertise, Deliberation, and Public Values. And we'll be putting a link to that in the chat for those of you who are interested. We're very pleased to be able to publish the book in open access, so all of the chapters are available readily and free of charge. So the book is the fruit of a multi-year research study. I'm just going to describe the study for you briefly, and then we're going to hear from our research team members. I'll turn it over to our moderator for today. So for those of you who work in the risk governance area, you will know that risk governance scholars and practitioners are grappling with how best to govern risk in the face of growing calls and rationales for democratization of decision-making. Public trust is central to effective risk governance. Perceptions of risk, as we know, are fragmenting. There are growing expectations for public involvement in risk decision-making. All of these things characterize risk governance in the 21st century. The COVID-19 global health pandemic is a vivid example that underscores the critical importance of public trust in risk decision-making. Whether trust in the safety of vaccines, trust in the necessity of lockdown measures, or trust in the very existence of the pandemic itself, successfully addressing the pandemic over time hinged on public confidence in government decisions. The pandemic also made visible how perceptions of risk can differ among and between experts and the public. How public perceptions of risk are forever vulnerable to misinformation and disinformation, and the importance for governments of incorporating the views of citizens, communities, and stakeholders into their decision-making. So against this backdrop, the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy created the project At Risk: How to Strengthen Risk Governance in Canada. The project aimed to advance scholarly and empirical understandings of public participation in risk decision-making, of ways to conceptualize and address differences in public and expert perceptions of risk, and means to foster public trust in risk governance. The project comprised a multidisciplinary research team of more than 24 scholars and graduate students from 11 Canadian and US universities. It was a very large team. and also included half a dozen senior practitioners from 5 partner organizations: the ISSP, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the Canadian Public Health Association, Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, and the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at North Carolina State University. The project received funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and Genome Canada, for which we are grateful, through their Partnership Development Grant Program, and the Faculty of Social Sciences also provided invaluable support to the project. Central to the project were practitioner members of the research team who gave generously of their time, experience, and insights throughout the study to ensure the research was grounded in and informed by the real worlds of risk governance. The project focused on 10 case studies in 3 policy areas: energy, that's what we're going to hear about today, public health, and genomics. Our session today features 2 academic members of the at-risk research team, Dr. Dwayne Bratt and Dr. Patricia Larkin, who will be introduced by our moderator in a moment. They will share their analyses on risk perception and energy decision-making, drawing on detailed case studies in 2 areas: nuclear waste management and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The session will be moderated by Julien Thome, doctoral candidate in public administration at the University of Ottawa School of Political Studies. Julien's doctoral research, and I am very honored to be his supervisor, focuses on large-scale nuclear energy transition in France. Julien holds an MSc in energy policy and an MA in geopolitics and grand strategy from the University of Sussex, and he also holds a BA in political studies from the American University of Beirut. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Julien and look forward to the session for today. Julien, over to you.
Thank you very much, Monica. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending this webinar, and our speakers for coming today and sharing their presentations. So I'd like to go ahead and present our speakers for today. Dr. Dwayne Bratt is a political science professor in the Department of Economics, Justice and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta. He teaches in the area of international relations and Canadian public policy. His research interests include Canadian nuclear policy, Canadian foreign policy, and Alberta politics. And we also have Dr. Patricia Larkin, PhD in population health from the University of Ottawa, and has a keen interest in the integration of health and environmental risk management in non-health sector policy and regulatory decision-making. And over the last 12 years, she has researched, she has focused a lot on dimensions of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So thank you both for coming today. And I'll go ahead and open the discussion for Dwayne with your presentation.
Okay. Thank you for that, Julian. So my presentation is to evaluate the risk management around the site selection process for Canada's high-level nuclear waste. In addition, we also look at the transportation routes beyond the site to carry used nuclear fuel to the permanent deep, what is known as the DGR, the Deep Geological Repository. This was more theoretical than actual, because until a final host is chosen, we can't be looking at transportation routes. A particular emphasis was on the public consultation for communities that were interested in hosting the DGR. And essentially, that's what we're doing. We're evaluating how the NWMO, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, reached out to these communities and engaged these communities. And the perception, not from the NWO's perspective, but from those people in the community. Okay? The NWMO was created in 2002 to find a site. Initially, there were 22 communities in Ontario as well as Saskatchewan interested in hosting the DGR. After a rigorous process that was both scientific and political, they have now shortlisted 2 sites, Ignis in Northwest Ontario and South Bruce in Southwest Ontario. They expect to have a preferred host to be chosen by 2024. We looked at, obviously, the NWO documents as well as supplemental material, but more importantly, we included a series of semi-structured interviews from participants in two potential host communities. Horn-Payne, which by the time we interviewed them had been removed from the consideration, and Ignis, which is still involved in the process. There were some real complications with these interviews because they occurred at the time of COVID. And so instead of visiting the communities as we had initially planned, those all had to be done virtually. So as part of the project, we identified all sorts of different types of risks. The technological risk about how would the DGR and the storage cask manage itself, not just for a year or two, but for years and years and years, thousands of years. The environmental risks about the potential contamination of soil and water, as well when you're looking at time periods as long as we were, the geological processes, the effects of climate change. Human health was another type of risk, exposure to radiation. Political risk, so the political opinions of that site community, what if those opinions changed over time? The views along the transportation routes, as well as larger public opinion, both in the province of Ontario or in Canada as a whole. Issues around security, the potential of a terrorist act or a transportation accident. And finally, financial risk. What is the cost of the project? What is the cost of maintaining and improving it, as well as the transportation routes? But we also noted that doing nothing is not risk-free. Canada has had nuclear energy going back to the 1940s. The waste has been stored on site over those many decades, but is that sustainable? So leaving the status quo in place is also risky. Also, it's important to note that there are different views on quantitative assessments of risk using probabilistic statistical analysis versus people's perception of risk. There's also a huge gap between experts' view of risk and the public assessment of risk. So this was all part of the work that we did. And to manage it, we, as well as many of the other chapters in the book, used what was called the REACT framework, that this is how governments and agencies can try to manage risk. Regulatory interventions such as the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, economic interventions such as providing funding for proper consultation processes, as well as the economic benefits that a host committee or host community would achieve. Advisory interventions where you bring in experts from a variety of different areas across the spectrum into the community to provide that scientific knowledge. Community interventions, so there would be long-scale consultations with the members of the community. And finally, technological interventions such as the casks and the DGR to begin with. Looking at the politics of this, we wanted to assess the level of democratization. We came up with a number of different principles. The issue of transparency. How transparent to the public were the decisions that were being made? Was there a rationale for the decisions being made? Were the uncertainties around risk clearly stated? And in the red below, these are the scores on a 10-point scale by the researchers, myself, Patricia Larkin, a couple other researchers, as well as the people that we interviewed. And you do see a gap between the researchers and the interviewees, but both believe that there was a degree of transparency in the process. Inclusiveness and representation. Where were the opportunities for public participation? Was there notification? Was a broad range of stakeholders? And again, you can see the scores below. They were not perfect, but they were well above the mean. Deliberation. What was the role of non-experts in risk management involving risk dimensions, risk estimations, risk control, communication strategies, monitoring and evaluation. And again, you can see the scores. This was probably the lowest of the aspects around democracy. And then the final one was accountability. Who was accountable? Is it the NWMO? Is it the town councils? Is it the Canadian Parliament? And you can see that there was a higher degree of accountability in this process, particularly on the researcher side. So overall, the case study shows that there was a high degree of consultation in this process, a high degree of democratization in this process. But I would be remiss if I wasn't able to give some explanations that this may not be applicable across all sectors. The advantage the NWMO had was time and money. And so this was a 20-year process with lots of resources because time was not of an essence at this moment. It has been currently stored on site. It could do that for a few more years. Will it continue to have to do that? So given the resources the NWMO had, I'm not sure how applicable this is across all spectrums. And finally, let's see what happens when a final host community is chosen, because they're very different. One is at the Bruce Power Plant, where a much larger population of Ontario is within driving distance. The other is, outside of, an hour and a half drive from Kenora, so a much more remote area. So at that point, I will stop sharing and I wait for questions and comments on my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. I'd like to encourage all the participants, all the attendants, to please post your questions and in the Q&A section of the webinar. And with that, we'll go ahead and continue with Patricia and your presentation.
Thank you, Julian. Just going to make sure everyone can see that. I'm guessing you can. So today I'm just going to spend a moment on how carbon capture and storage can be a climate change mitigation technology, and then delve into 3 issues, socioeconomic risk issues that can affect public confidence. So most of you have probably seen some variation of this type of graph, Canada's total emissions reductions projections. This was from 2022, the more recent federal reporting. I just want to highlight that 78% of these emissions is attributed to carbon dioxide, and that 3 economic sectors represent about 50% of the CO2, where carbon capture, utilization, and storage can fit in. That's heavy industry such as cement and steel, coal or natural gas-fired electricity plants, and oil and gas development, including oil sands upgraders. So you may wonder how CCUS can help, and that's the acronym I'm going to use today. So it is applied to point source industry sites or power generation sites, or like I said, well, all types of industry. I'll just leave it broadly at that. And there's several ways of after the CO2 is captured at the smokestack, essentially, it would normally, for capture in sequestration, what's highlighted here right now, that's where it's transported by pipeline as supercritical, so it's liquefied at a process at the capture plant, and then injected underground into a suitable geologic formation 800 to 2,000 meters below the surface. So that's CCS, carbon capture and sequestration. We have also the use of the U, carbon capture utilization, and this is in several streams. One is what you might have heard of most is enhanced oil recovery. So this liquefied CO2 helps to release tertiary oil reserves that are hard to get and can get more oil out of the ground. And then on the conversion, that's where the CO2 is used in different chemical or mineral processes to create other products. Essentially, for instance, the concrete industry is a leader in that regard. So really brief background on how CCUS can help at point source emissions. And generally, this is now called carbon tech in the people that work in this area, by the people. There are benefits and concerns. For instance, obviously showing how industry can contribute to climate change mitigation or need to because of Canadian targets, for instance, and provincial targets. There's employment at the facilities in creating the pipelines, in employment in continued operations that otherwise may not be permitted as such, depending on our goals. There's employment in research and public sector policy and regulatory development, all kinds of employment. And then on the scientific knowledge and transfer, Canada is part of international agreements to share information. On the concerns, there are hazards to this type of technology, like any, and no time to really delve into this, but just to say that on the natural and engineering systems, there's contaminants used in capture, there's failures, potential failures, there's potential seismicity or surface leakage, all attenuated now because of choosing good sites for carbon capture and storage. So mostly not heard of, but the potential risk is there. And these affect human health and the environment in terms of inhalation. When CO2 is compressed like that, it's at a higher concentration than humans and animals can breathe. On the other end of the scale, there's unanticipated leakage rates to the atmosphere, again, if the site isn't well chosen and things happen underground. Which of course would negate the whole purpose of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, where it is pumped into the geology. So while Canadians have significant expertise in the public sector, in the companies, and in advocacy groups, this technology still faces socioeconomic and political challenges and risks. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to focus on 3 risk issues that we studied. And this research is based on interviews, well, a lot of background documentation, but also on interviews of experts representing the federal government, industry, and in several sectoral applications, research and funding institutes or organizations, as well as NGOs. So all of these are a two-way street. They can affect or be affected by risk perception, and many are interconnected. The ones on the left, cross-cutting factors, are implications for government, industry, and the public, whereas, as you can see, the 2 subsections on the right are more focused on one group or another. While I go through this, keep in mind that these risk issues can occur at the policy or the project level, and sometimes both. And on the left, in blue, the knowledge and tolerable costs are 2 of 3 of the highest mentioned risk issues by the participants in this study. So on that note, in turning to knowledge and information provision, we do have a definition. that this would support awareness, common understanding, and distribution of information, that sort of ball of wax. And note that more technical information and knowledge doesn't always necessarily increase support or acceptance of a technology. That's something everyone needs to keep in mind. And that, like Monica mentioned at the outset, risk perception varies between experts and the public. So this provision of information can slow down or block carbon capture, utilization, and storage acceptance. And I guess I do have a quote there, and I know these slides will be made available later, but this is the type of response that one of our interviewees mentioned during our call, that not everyone understands this technology very well. So how do you deal with that? The interviewees came up with, and this is also based on Dwayne introduced the REACT framework to identify risk management options in different areas. So again, we use the same here for my study. And on an advisory basis, of course, you can develop a more supportive narrative around your technology. You can improve outreach. One thing that came out was to talk a lot more about both capture and storage, because it's the storage that counts when you're talking about greenhouse gas emissions. And demonstrate at the time of this study the relevance outside of fossil fuel applications, because there's been a lot of practice around oil and gas and coal. But like I said earlier, there's great interest in the energy intensive industries like cement and steel. And then on tolerable costs, this, not expecting you to read the detail on here, I just wanted to illustrate the range of programs currently offered by the federal government related to CCUS and where some money lies. Of course, actually, and we might get into this in the questions, there's a lot about the cost of carbon capture and CCUS and how that's inhibiting its project development. The participants noted that if capture innovation is subsidized by government, it could lead to negative public perceptions because of the concern over perceived favoritism for fossil fuels. So it's contentious, and since the time of the study, as this slide demonstrates, there is a lot of policy support in terms of financial remedies to help projects get underway. So the economic options are the emphasis, obviously, in this area. Interview participants focused on the need for the value proposition for carbon, the need for tax incentives, cost sharing, and additional support for demonstration and pilot projects. But I wanted to raise 3 points that bring this study right up to date. One is where investment tax credits, which are under development federally, were highlighted as key to the project risk management. So that's around the cost. And then on the other side, you've heard perhaps Capital Power's announcement to cancel their proposed $2.4 billion Genesee project in Alberta just a few weeks ago. So we've got incentives and we've got some projects still being canceled. And then most recently last week, the executive chair of the Pathways Alliance, and that's the group representing Canada's largest oil sands companies, and they have a flagship proposal for a carbon capture and storage hub. And he has publicly pushed Pierre Poilievre to clarify his position on industrial carbon pricing, because all this uncertainty, if there's a change of government, could affect their plans. And then on our last note, last risk issue for today, the procedural justice is related to process and being transparent, engaged, accountable, all those things that Dwayne went through for the nuclear waste disposal. And we all have to remember that transparency also, it really is fundamentally based on easy access to documents so that people can feel they are, can be ingrained in a decision process. And this quote here, I like the line, so really you're bringing society into the technology and in understanding concerns. And risk management options include several areas: policy, regulatory, and since my background's in risk assessment and risk management, I'll put this one as using an appropriate level of study in that regard. And a little bit different on the economic front, the idea that all those previously mentioned incentive programs, that you include third-party reviews of applications as a way to demonstrate open and transparent process. And then advisory-based, again, ensuring transparency and sharing around the information that's available. So that's it for the presentation. And there is one other slide with I can show where, anyway, for the YouTube, but there are a bunch of other risk management options under different parts of that REACT framework for other issues that you can read about in the chapter in the book. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And thank you to both of our panelists for your presentations. So we'll go ahead and move on to the Q&A section. Thank you for everyone who's posting your questions. I invite you all to keep them coming. We'll start with one for Dwayne from Mark Lowy. Dwayne, did you look in detail at how NWMO approached each of the selected communities? And if so, were there any significant differences in NWMO's approach to one community compared with the other?
So that's an interesting question. When we did the interviews with the two communities, Ignis and Hornpain, we didn't see any differences, any significant differences between how the NWMO approached both of them. There were a lot of overlap and similarities in the process that they did. Now, there were 22 communities. We interviewed 2, but given that one made it forward, one made it was removed from consideration, I would imagine it was a similar process that played out in all of them. I can imagine that the scientific analysis would have been obviously different, but the process, I think, would have been the same.
Thank you very much. We have here a question for Patricia. Has the use of CCUS increased over time, and how do you see it being more used in the future? And how do you see the government play a role in expanding the use of CCUS?
We can say that it has increased over time, but significantly more slowly than most jurisdictions and international organizations would propose as necessary for this technology to mitigate emissions as it could. The number of projects needs to escalate dramatically worldwide if it's going to capture the point source emissions that are needed in these sectors where it can be used. how do you, one little point is that, for instance, in 2009, the IEA thought CCS would capture maybe 19% or be responsible for 19% of emissions reductions. And we're down for CCS to around 14 by now. And at the same time, other technologies such as the use of renewables or energy efficiency have taken up that slack, going from maybe 34 to 44% of responsibility for emissions reduction. So carbon capture is still, all hands on deck, but it isn't where people ever thought it should be. So that's a long answer for that. But how do you see the government play a role? Well, I guess because of the high cost, it's one of those ones where at a meeting I was at, the comment was, we're not doing this out of the goodness of our heart. And so if carbon emissions aren't, they're just, the cost of carbon emissions just isn't high enough for the business case right now to jump onto such an expensive technology to reduce those under a company's or an industry's own volition. And it's kind of a double-edged sword, because sometimes industry says this is a proven technology, and sometimes they say we need more money to demonstrate that it works. So I find, and that's not in the report, but I kind of find that a conflict when you see both those sides mentioned by the same group of people. So I'm not sure whether government can do anything more. It's certainly on the radar now, and especially for the hard to abate sectors like steel and cement. Certainly a big role, and maybe even more support in that area than the usual conversation about its use in the oil and gas production.
Thank you very much for your answer. We have here another question for Dwayne from Matthew Dalzett. Your work identified a number of different types of risk. The NWMO and other organizations have done a lot of outreach into the candidate host communities, both pro and con. How effective were those efforts in supporting the appreciation of risks and informed decision-making in the community?
Hey, Matt, good to hear from you. I think they were effective. Now, bear in mind, some of the people that we interviewed were so opposed to nuclear waste that they gave scores of 0 right across the board. They would acknowledge that stuff existed, the consultation was occurring, experts were brought in, but they minimized all of that. But I think a more objective analysis is they brought in anti-nuclear activists as speakers. Gordon Edwards, for example, visited many of these communities, as well as scientists that were not necessarily affiliated with the nuclear industry. And so I think they did take a large attempt at providing materials and evidence across the nuclear spectrum and allow the members of the community to evaluate those. And I think that was one of the strengths of this, that they didn't just bring in the people who designed the casts to say, look how safe and effective these were. They brought in a variety of different viewpoints.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. We have here another question for Patricia. Thank you everyone for your questions. Please keep them coming. For Patricia from Mark Lowy. What do you think the greatest risk is for the Pathways Alliance project not going ahead, e.g. cost, public perception that taxpayers shouldn't be subsidizing this project, potential change of federal government and policy, etc.?
Mark, could be all of the above. I don't think I could project exactly what the greatest risk is. I think we know that all those balls are in the air, and in the end, yeah, I couldn't really. That's my opinion. All of the above, and some combination of that.
If you were to rank them in your mind right now, which one do you think is like weighs the more?
I don't know. I'm a little leery of part 3. No, there is a concern in our other work in positive energy for the implications of whiplash in the policy support for climate, generally climate mitigation, as well as the ways to support it in different industry sectors.
Thank you very much. We have one question from an anonymous attendee, but I'm unclear as to who this is directed to. So if you could clarify, if you're listening in. In the meantime, I do have other questions as well.
Actually, Julian, I would interrupt. I think Dwayne might be able to jump on that one a little bit for the NWMO if he recalls what the budget of that organization has been.
Well, Dwayne, what percentage of your project budgets are allocated to stakeholder consultation and communications?
Yeah, we weren't able to break that down, but given there was a sense from all sides, opponents and proponents in the communities, that there was vast amounts of resources pumped into consultation. The critics saw it as trying to bribe them. Proponents saw it as a worthwhile endeavor, but I don't have the actual breakdown of the budget to determine how much of that budget of the NWMO was allocated to consultation. But as I said, the interviewees that we spoke to all believe that there was a significant amount of resources pumped in. They had different interpretations of that, but they all acknowledged the resources that were put into it.
I could just add,
Sure.
Julian, that earlier the better. And as we know from our timelines research project, that this stakeholder consultation and communications for some of the CCS projects started don't know about all of them, but for Quest, it started well before the project was officially put on the books in terms of an application to the regulator. So it's better. It usually works out better that way, and issues can be ironed out so that the regulatory process is not long and drawn out, and sometimes goes to the courts precisely for these types of issues.
And I would add on that in the nuclear waste case, the timelines were long. They remain ongoing for South Bruce and Ignis. But when we talked to the community members, one of the comments that kept coming up was just how long the consultation process was. And they said, just hurry it up. Like, enough's enough. Like, make a decision. And for the Horn-Payne people, they believed that they were simply, the consultation strung them along longer than it needed to be. So it was like, hurry up and make a decision already, which I found striking. Usually the comment that we get on consultations and think about, for example, oil and gas pipelines, is that they don't spend enough time on this. This is a case where the community members felt that perhaps they were spending too much time.
Yeah, nuclear waste projects tend to drag on for a very long time. I remember the OPG's Deep Geological Repository also lasted approximately 20 years before it eventually was shuttered down. So fairly notorious in that regard. In regards to so Dwayne, a question for you in regards to the economic incentives. To what extent do you think these economic incentives for DGR projects impact risk perception and assessment in the mind of the concerned communities? And specifically, what in your mind do you think are the first classes of risks which are mitigated by these incentives and which are the least affected by them?
Yeah, so members in both Ignis and Hornpain talked about the economic benefits that would accrue to their communities, and in the sense of jobs, investment, etc. And that seemed to overwhelm the other risks that were there for some. Others believed that it did not overwhelm it, and in fact, it was an attempt, as I said, of buying them off. But the use of economic levers, I think, was important to deal with risk. I think the NWMO, to its credit, went well beyond that, right? In the technological stuff, the regulatory stuff, to be able to separate. The NWMO does the site selection process, but the licensing would all go through the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And so I think they made that divide quite clear to people. So there was more mitigation strategy than just the economics, but the economics was the one that kept coming up in the public's mind. And part of it is they may not grasp the full technological capabilities. You know, they're not engineers, they're not physicists, they're not geologists, but they did understand jobs.
As something that hits home much more and is a lot less abstract than
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. And I have a question for Patricia. In regards to the definition of tolerable costs in risk perception and assessment in the context of CCUS projects, how liable is this definition of tolerable costs to changes in a broader environment and circumstances, in your opinion?
Thanks, Julian. I think part of the answer is that tolerable depends on the individuals or the corporations or the public sector's point of view. Yes, it can change as the emphasis of different technological options to mitigate GHG emissions may rise or fall over time. And I guess on risk perception, like we've said, it differs between different people. But for cost, it comes down to the proponent's final investment decision, I think. And that same conference on barriers out west, they suggested the need for a 16 to 18% return on investment for a big CCUS project. And I'm not an economist, but that's where this idea around the investment tax credit is so important component to support those decisions at the current time. And I can say that the cost of capture is coming down. And so historically, it's been the highest cost component, maybe because geology is free. I don't know. But anyway, getting the emitters to make that decision for that item is a challenge. And like I've maybe insinuated, over my period of studying these various dimensions of this technology, it has had its fits and starts. 2012 to 2015, a lot of interest. Then it swayed and it's back into the forefront. So like I said earlier, now it's a question of policy uncertainty in support. So tolerable cost, probably a bit of a moving target for any, for all options on the table as we move forward.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one final question. We'll direct it to Dwayne. So in the context of nuclear waste management in Canada, how does the federal nature of the Canadian government really and its regulatory bodies impact risk assessment and risk perception within that domain?
Yeah, so there's a lot of obviously federal aspects of nuclear energy writ large. Nuclear energy is in the domain of the federal government, but electricity generation is in the domain of provincial governments. And sometimes those two orders of government have worked together. Sometimes they have clashed. On the issue of nuclear waste, we really didn't see a federal aspect to it. Now, in part, it's because all of the, well, there were some initial communities from Saskatchewan, they were removed quite quickly and were brought all into Ontario. But the Ontario government has largely stayed out of this, and this has solely been the domain of the federal government because waste doesn't make money. Waste costs money. So it's easy for the province to say, you take care of it. Where it might become more interesting is if we see an expansion of small modular reactors across the country, because then dealing with that waste is going to extend those transportation routes. So you can imagine if they build an SMR in Estevan, Saskatchewan, or in Fort McMurray, Alberta, the transportation of that waste to a permanent place in South Bruce or in Ignis is going to complicate things. Just as we see issues with pipelines, I don't think the issue is going to be in Alberta or in Ontario, but it could occur in Manitoba or the process of moving waste from Point Lepreau in New Brunswick to the permanent site could cause problems in the province of Quebec. So it's those intermediary points that's where we could start to see some of this federal role coming in, is around the transportation routes. It's a big country.
Thank you very much. We have one final question from Louis Simard. Two questions for Dwayne. The first one, can you develop on the economic intervention linked with the consultation process? Any examples, kind, amount, for whom, when, or just developing on this aspect? Is it strictly linked with the consultation process, financing groups to develop expertise, for example, or is it what we call the IBA, impact on and benefit agreements?
So there are a variety of tools that they use. Part of that is bringing in speakers from across the spectrum. Some of it was hosting open houses. Some of it was actually bringing them down into Southern Ontario to tour existing nuclear facilities and test casks and things like that. Some of it was simply sponsorship of community events, like Canada Day celebration. So there were a number of different initiatives where they used economic intervention.
Okay, and the second question he has is on democratization. 6.3, 6.4, or 5.9 out of 10 is a high degree. For our master and PhD programs, this would be failed.
Yes, it would. And I do master's programs as well, but put it in a different way, 3.9 or 4.1 would get you a majority government in Canada, right? So it's all in your interpretation of what that 10 is. And as I said, there were people who just gave zeros across the board, even when they acknowledged the amount of time that was spent. They all thought that they were trying to brainwash them. So every 10-point scale is different, and I wouldn't use the grading scale of universities as far as this is concerned.
Thank you very much. I think that about wraps up our Q&A session. Thank you both of you for your answers. Thank you everyone for the questions that you've posted.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for everybody for coming.
I'll go ahead and give this off to Yasmina for our closing remarks.
Hello, my name is Yasmina from the ISSP Communications. So first of all, I wanted to thank our panelists today for taking the time to join us for our May edition for the Food for Thought. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. I would also like to thank Julien for moderating this great discussion, and of course, thanking all the participants that took their lunch hour to join us. Please feel free to click the links that I shared earlier in this event. And visit our website. The recording is going to be available on YouTube and as well as in our webpage. And we'll see you in September for new Food for Thoughts. And next month, we're going to have our recap activity. So all the events we've had since January and our blogs. So we'll see you soon. Thank you so much and have a great day.